We haven't talked about this topic in a while, so why not do so now? Climate change, the topic you probably have in your head but choose not to think about because it just makes you depressed. I mean, I sure get depressed about this sometimes. It's like one of 100 things that makes me sad, and the worst part is, it's entirely in our own control. You know, in a way I understand the points of view from skeptics. It's a complicated situation, and if my brain were too small to understand it, I too would be skeptical. And then other than that, there are people who don't really want to take a stance. These are the types that go like, I don't know, I need to do some investigating. Perhaps both sides are wrong. Which, you know, I find it funny when people try to take the position in between for the sole reason that the topic is supposedly controversial. If you have a good reason to do so, then fine, you do you. I just dislike it when these people portray the idea that both sides are crazy, you know, when in reality only one of them are. Anyway, that was just a small rant. Today we have a video I found from a channel that does a lot of interviews with various people and scientists on climate change, many of which, you guessed it, are skeptics. We're just gonna have a look at this introduction video he has just to get a feel.
My interest in climate was piqued in 2006 when I watched An Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore. Like so many people, I wanted to know what was going on. I was worried. I was worried for myself and I was worried for them. I'd go to dinner parties and around the table climate was on everyone's mind.
Yeah. When I go to dinner parties, I too think about climate change. Oh wait, no, I don't. That thought is kind of funny though. Like at a party, it's just like the elephant in the room. Everyone's thinking, oh, when are we talking about climate change?
At some of those dinner parties, I dared to ask questions about the science, only to be put in my place being told that the science was settled. Apparently, most scientists agree that human activity has now overtaken any and all natural changes that have been occurring for millennia.
Apparently, there's just a stupid lie going around that there isn't a scientific consensus on climate change. There is, it's pretty clear. And there's even consensus that there's consensus. I did a video on the scientific consensus on climate change a while ago. Perhaps check it out if you have time. Or, you know, don't. Feel free to just continue sniffing glue. Anyway, the agreed upon idea isn't that human activity's influence on the climate has overtaken all natural changes that have occurred over the last millennia. That's just such a straw man, I don't even know where to begin with that claim. The consensus is that global warming is happening and it is caused by human activity. There's nothing about human activity surpassing that of natural forces, because scientists understand that that's not the case. Look, warming and cooling for the Earth is a positive feedback loop, and this is due to many of the natural mechanisms that exist. For example, if ice caps melt, there will be less surface area of ice, which will ultimately reflect less sunlight back into space. That's a good one. Or that clouds tend to migrate to higher altitudes, which serve to better reflect radiation that tries to escape out to space. I did a video briefly talking about that once. Or what about methane being released from within the melted ice, or more water taking the form of water vapor, which is also a greenhouse gas. The list of positive feedback loops are endless. So essentially, if you have a little bit of warming at first, it can set off a continuous cycle of warming driven by natural forces. The initial push can be anything. In the past, it has been other natural causes, but today we know that it is human activity. Our emissions of CO2 is the reason the Earth is entering a positive feedback loop of warming. Now, does that mean that human activity surpasses natural forces? Absolutely not, but we've set off those natural forces, and that's why it's dangerous.
And it is, thankfully, within our power and our responsibility to make things return to normal.
Yes, I mean, I think we can agree that if what scientists say are true, then it'd be our responsibility to mitigate as much of the damage as we can, and this is perfectly feasible. The technology for renewable energy is already here, and yes, while it is indeed expensive to implement, renewable energy has the advantage of being here for a long time. You essentially pay an initial cost and then maintenance afterwards is incredibly cheap, especially compared to fossil fuels in which you have to constantly mine and look for new sources. If you don't like the government controlling all of this, fine. Just give more incentives for businesses to invest in renewable energy. Taking away subsidies for fossil fuels is a good start. China, for example, is investing a lot into renewable energy and is one of the biggest producers of solar panels in the world. Compared to that, the US is pretty far behind.
I'm sure I heard Al Gore say that when you take water vapor out of the mix of greenhouse gases, CO2 accounted for 30% of all greenhouse gases. That statement made me wonder, well, if you take water vapor out of the mix, what percentage does water vapor represent? The answer appears to be 80% of total greenhouse gas mass and 90% of greenhouse volume. Then to complicate an appreciation of the effect of water vapor in clouds, you have to take into the fact that they account for 66 to 85% of the greenhouse effect. It's complicated, and water vapor plays an enormous role. Okay, I thought, that's odd. If someone's playing with numbers by excluding the major greenhouse gas, what else is being misrepresented?
You know, there's a more honest position to take, and here it is. If I were in your shoes and I learned about water vapor being the more influential greenhouse gas, my first thought wouldn't be, they lied to me. What else could they possibly be hiding? My first thought would be, there's probably a scientific explanation for this. Let me spend 2 seconds doing a Google search so I can become more educated. But yeah, I get it. Moving your fingers to do a Google search can be pretty difficult. It'll cost you like 2 kcal of energy, so it's not worth it. Instead, you can sit there and I'll give you a brief explanation. The Earth has many mechanisms in place, and that includes a mechanism to cycle molecules. There's a carbon cycle, for example, which has carbon as the form of CO2 in the air and has chains of sugar inside plants and animals. It's just a natural cycle that puts carbon through many different forms, but eventually cycles around. It's the same for the water cycle. A huge implication of these cycles is that the overall amount of this substance will always remain the same, unless another factor comes into play. Take the water cycle, for example. Any water that evaporates into the atmosphere will eventually come back down as rain. The total amount of water is the same. As a result, the amount of water vapor at any given time is relatively similar. It's like a mini negative feedback loop. Too much vapor, rain. Too little vapor, evaporation. So even though water vapor contributes to the majority of the greenhouse effect, its levels remain relatively constant. The only way you can significantly increase the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere is if you add to the total amount of water in the water cycle. Now let's look at carbon. The carbon cycle works the same way. The amount of carbon will always remain the same unless there is some outside source. Without human activity, this is the case. CO2 goes into the atmosphere through respiration. It then gets absorbed by plants and bacteria to be turned into sugar. Sugar gets eaten by plants and animals for energy and then escapes back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The total amount of carbon normally would remain the same in this cycle. However, if you add an external source of carbon, in this case fossil fuels, then the total amount of carbon in the cycle will increase, because carbon molecules that are stored underground are not officially part of this complete cycle. If you add more total carbon in the cycle, then there will be more carbon everywhere, including the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's the same with any cycle. In the water cycle, if you somehow got an external source of water and added it to the cycle, then you would have more water everywhere, including water vapor in the atmosphere. But that's not the case in our current situation. We are adding carbon into the atmosphere, not water. And this ties back to earlier when I talked about the positive feedback loops of warming. It's not what causes the most warming that matters. It's what causes that initial push of warming that does. Water vapor, even if it is the most influential heat trapper in the atmosphere right now, is not increasing in activity. Carbon dioxide is, and that's why we talk about CO2 and not water vapor. There's another factor that I forgot to mention in which the increase of carbon dioxide and temperature will also increase the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, since more heat promotes its vapor form more. This is just another feedback loop we need to consider.
By then I had learned to ask a question about the sun. What about the effect of the sun, I asked her. And she said, oh no, the sun was not a factor because it stays at a constant temperature. I looked it up and she was right. The photosphere of the sun stays at a pretty constant temperature of about 5,600 degrees Celsius. However, at the time, I didn't know to ask the follow-up question about solar energy fluctuations. I knew nothing about solar maximums and solar minimums, and I'd never even heard of solar cycles.
Bringing up the sun is always such a dumb argument. Yes, the sun is a huge influencer on how our climate is, but you could just look up data to see that the sun hasn't increased its output in 4 decades now, and has actually slightly diminished during that time. Sun cycles is indeed something the sun goes through, but these cycles stabilize relatively quickly and do not explain the increase in temperature whatsoever. Again, a simple Google search would give you a lot of these answers, or if you wanted to be super authentic, you could read some actual scientific papers, which is what I recommend. I've argued with a lot of climate change skeptics, and one thing I found out that they have in common is that they usually haven't read a single primary source on the topic. When was the last time I saw a skeptic criticize a scientific paper? Never. When was the last time I saw a skeptic read a scientific paper? Also never. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but that it seems that the majority of them don't understand the difference between science popularizers and actual science.
The message keeps coming back that we're not doing enough, and the world is disintegrating in front of our eyes. Species are dying. Let's go back to the example of the polar bears. I remember turning to the pages of National Geographic to see polar bears dying, apparently due to melting ice and increasing temperatures in the Arctic. Unfortunately, I then was disappointed to learn that National Geographic had to apologize for printing a story that apparently misrepresented the fact. The polar bear that was shown was actually an old bear who was about to die from natural causes. If I can't trust that magazine, Who can I trust?
Yeah, you don't have to trust magazines at all. You can trust scientific papers instead. How about that? Okay, on the topic of polar bears, with all the images of like polar bears standing on the small chunk of ice and whatnot, that's not really what's happening, admittedly. It's just an exaggeration. They're not necessarily dying because the ice is completely melting and that they end up drowning, but they are dying from various other factors such as malnutrition due to the melting ice retreating faster and shortening their feeding season. They have to swim longer, which could cause death from fatigue. Many of them are malnourished. These are all things that the polar bear has to deal with due to the increase in temperature, and the loss of their habitat definitely isn't helping. Now, that doesn't mean polar bears are going to go extinct anytime soon, but their population will significantly reduce over the next few decades, which will eventually put them in the endangered status. Perhaps we should reduce the damage now while we still can, don't you think?